Hello, I'm Bruce Chapman, the chairman of the board of Discovery Institute, and I'm happy to welcome you to a discussion about the Israel test with George Gilder. My own background in Israel was as a kid going across the Green Line in the old days, 1965, and I wrote in my diary that it was like leaving a desert and going into a garden, crossing from Jordan into Israel. Nothing has changed. It's still the case, except there's a bigger Israel after a couple of wars. A few years later, many years later, I was the U.S. ambassador to the UN organizations in Vienna, which included UNRWA, the refugee program for Palestinian refugees. So I went down and saw those camps. And from that time on, I realized that Israel was very dynamic, but these Palestine refugee camps were backwaters of welfare state, a kind of welfare state where people didn't have anything much to do. A few years after that, I founded Discovery Institute with my friend George Gilder, who I had worked with for years and years. And of course, George has written a number of books on technology, economics, and social policy. But we wound up after a conference in Istanbul, I think it was in 2008, in Jerusalem on a trip because he wanted to explore the technology developments in that country. And I went along, and he said one evening, Bruce, I think there's a book in this. I want to write a book about Israel. And since then, he did write a book about Israel, and it's been a big hit. It was published in 2009, and then it came out in paperback in 2012. And people are still reviewing that book. I have a review from the Jewish research group from a couple months ago that came out based on the 2012 book. And I've also had people tell me who have read it also in recent months and said it reads like it was written yesterday. Well, the good news is that while people were talking that way, George actually was revising the book for a new version, which will be coming out very shortly, called The Israel Test again, but it will be with a new introduction, this time by Dennis Prager, and by George, but a foreword by Dennis Prager. And of course, it's all taken place after the October 7 massacre of Israelis by Palestinian Hamas figures in Gaza. So, George, going back, let's start with that trip in 2008. What motivated you? What triggered your interest in writing a book on this subject?
Well, I wrote a book called Microcosm about the rise of the semiconductor industry. And I discovered that Intel Corporation really was rooted in Israel. Its first successful product was a non-volatile memory chip designed by Dov Froman Bankowski. Dov Froman who was one of the founders of Intel. And it saved Intel during the early years when it invented the integrated circuit, but there was no real market for that initially, and it was hard to build. And really, Intel, which was the heart of the U.S. semiconductor industry, I believe is virtually half an Israeli company. It was some of his founders came from Israel. It was its first successful product came from Israel, and now many of its microprocessors are designed in Israel, and its biggest, most sophisticated wafer fab, that's wafer fabrications factory, this is where chips are made. The most advanced technology in the world is really microchips. And Intel's most sophisticated fab by many measures is in Kiryat Gat on the desert in Israel. Hopefully it escaped any damage during the Hamas attacks, but I discovered that lots of American technology companies are dependent on resources and intellect and engineering genius and invention from Israel, from Microsoft, Google's. We all marvel at Google's maps as we drive down the highways, and that's really the heart of it is from a company called Waze, which was an Israeli company purchased by Google. IBM has, when it had its great triumph in chess, the IBM computational chess champion came from an Israeli outpost of IBM. It's just, you can go, and a lot of our biotech, and it just and my new book, which I'm writing now, is about graphene, which is a single layer of carbon that is the most important breakthrough in recent technology. And it really originated at Jim Tour's laboratory in Rice University in the United States, but of the companies springing from Tour's lab at Rice in Houston, 18 of them found their funding in Israel. And so 18 of these companies...
Not in the United States.
Not in the United States. We're focusing on AI and software, and Israelis could really grasp, before Americans, the transformative potential in materials science, what I call the nanocosm. I wrote about the microcosm, and this is the next big step in the quantum world, making two-dimensional materials that are 200 times stronger than steel, as elastic as rubber, 1,000 times more conductive than copper. Just really transformative technologies come from Israel regularly, and Israel now represents an economic miracle that is, Israel's per capita income in the midst of all these wars and intifadas and hostilities is now moved ahead of Britain, South Korea, Germany, Japan. It's China. It's amazing.
Well, what you found out, in other words, back in 2008, was that there was a dynamic culture of entrepreneurship and invention going on in Israel. In fact, I think in your introduction, you point out it's much more supple and nimble than in the United States, because we have, for example, in the defense industry, we have endless reviews and studies and people doing oversight committees and so forth, and we don't get these new weapon systems developed for 10 years. Meanwhile, in Israel, they're doing it on the fly. They're literally on the fly. They're inventing while they go along.
Under stress of attack, I was involved early in developing the SDI. I didn't develop the SDI, but I counseled Reagan personally and gave him his first microchip and said this would make SDI possible. And I showed him a Micron technology, DRAM, that's dynamic random access memory, computer chip from Idaho. And he was very interested and talked for half an hour about it. But SDI really didn't happen in the United States, but it happened in Israel because Israel was the first country really to fully engage with the U.S. in developing SDI, and that saved SDI because,
Well, it also saved Israel because unlike the United States, which does not have rockets aiming at it and shooting at it, they have had the rockets flying at them. They needed to do something. So, George, this is not a picture.
It's called Iron Dome.
Well, Iron Dome, and then
David Sling and Arrow, and now Iron Beam, which is a laser technology to intercept rockets with lasers.
I would say that 99.9% of Americans do not know anything about this. When they hear about Israel, they don't know. But I am confident that 100% of the people who riot at universities have no idea of what modern Israel is like and what a dynamic country it has become. Let's go back before your visit. Let's go back before my first time that I was ever in Israel to 100 years ago. And I remember when Mark Twain in the 19th century wrote about Israel, the Holy Land, he described it as barren and empty, and there was hardly anybody there, it seemed. There were a few Jews, there were a few Arabs, but basically there was not much going on except some ruins. Then Jews started arriving. What happened, and what sort of turned you on to that aspect of, well, most people do not know any of this history?
Yeah, well, I had an amazing experience after the first edition of the Israel Test, which was published by a friend of mine, Richard Vigilante. It was his first book of his publishing company, and it came out and attracted attention in 2008? Nine. And I was giving a speech about it to audience in Rockaway, Queens in New York. And after the speech, a long line of people to sign the book, and one of the people, I still don't know who he was, but he said, "You should read this book." And he gave me a little dog-eared volume called On Palestine, called by a Christian missionary expert on agriculture for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. He was his assistant secretary of agriculture, or expert, and named Walter Clay Loudermilk. And this book just detailed how the Jewish settlers moving in the mid 20th century, when there were only some 200,000 to 300,000 Arabs, mid-19th century. Mid-19th century, when there were only 200 to 300,000 Arabs, and with average life expectancy of 35 years. They were really Bedouins, and that was who was in Israel at that time. At that time, Jordan was much more heavily populated and prosperous than Palestine, and these, but the pogroms in Russia and the Ukraine drove this immigration of Jews to Israel, and which was then Palestine, and they used all their funds to buy land from the Arabs. They paid 4 times as much as anyone had paid for land. They paid a total, in just a few years, they paid some $18 million to Arabs in $1942, which was Loudermilk's
reference.
But anyway, Loudermilk studied this process whereby this land, which had been deserted and depleted, and he depicted it as an environmental catastrophe, was revived by Jewish settlers and it was the Jewish settlers reviving the land, multiplying the trees and irrigating and creating prosperous towns, and that attracted a massive influx of Arabs from Jordan and Syria and Iraq and neighboring Lebanon, neighboring countries, and hugely, and the Jews also brought medicine and banished the mosquitoes that cause malarial swamps in many parts of. And the result was that the Arabs had a population boom. I mean, they grew. The Arab population grew 16% a year for decades under the influence of this expansion of opportunity and possibility. The genius of the Jews applying it themselves again to the Holy Land, made it once again a land of milk and honey, and Arabs migrated to it massively, and that's the history. It's not the settlers came in and seized anything; they bought.
Well, they also were being forced out not only of Russia and the Ukraine, but out of Germany, obviously with the Holocaust coming in, with the Nazis coming in, and so forth, that hundreds of thousands, millions of people were being killed, and then others were in the Zionist movement, which started in the 19th century under Herzog. The people started coming into Israel, and yet. And they were very inventive. That these agricultural developments, such as irrigation, were pioneered in many cases. Didn't Loudermilk talk about that?
Yeah, well, Israel is the world leader in desalinization and Israel, during the history of Israel, it's actually reduced its consumption of water per capita because of the miraculous breakthroughs in desalinization and drip irrigation, and it's just a fabulous agricultural technology feat that preceded the information technology and biotech, where Israel really leads the world. This whole idea that Israel is somehow dependent on the U.S., I think we're more dependent on Israel than they are on us. It's a mutual relationship, but Israel has thrived in the face of a lot of hostility from the State Department and from many American forces, and so it just isn't true that Israel is a frail dependency. It's really the spearhead of world technology, just as Jews are the spearhead of global intellect. This is something that us WASPs and other folks may have trouble recognizing, but here Jews are now less than 0.2%, to 0.2 of 1% of the world population. And they're about half of the rich people in the world. The top 10 are about half Jewish, depending on how you identified. And and the Nobel Prizes are overwhelming. More than half the Nobel prizes are awarded to Jews. It's just Jews are the spearhead of world achievement in capitalism, and many people hate this.
Let me back.
This force, this capitalist force of creativity on which all our lives ultimately depend. We're dependent on a tiny minority of creative people.
Let me back up a bit. In the 19th century and into the 20th century until World War I, that whole area was part of the Ottoman Empire, and it was a backwater. Yeah. There were Jews there, but there were also, as you said, Bedouin Arabs and others. And then people started coming in. And then in 1948, the modern state of Israel was declared. The United States was the first country to recognize it, but it was also recognized by the Soviet Union, and it was very popular on the left. So in those days, Americans on the left loved Israel. Now Americans on the left are very critical of Israel. So something happened in between, and I think it was a change in government policy, because they were very smart people. The culture, as you said, the Jewish culture, for example, stresses family, it stresses education and hard work. These are all qualities that are not just found among Jews, found successful people everywhere. So Israel was successful, but it didn't really take off for a long time economically. Did it? And what had happened?
Well, it was socialist. And although the government was was favorable to agriculture, and all the redemption of the land was accomplished, their economic policies were socialist, and by mid 1985, the country had reached the end of the line. Its economy was coming to resemble Argentina's today. It was headed to 1,000% inflation every year. It was a terrible economic crisis that almost stopped the whole Israel in its tracks. And Israel was retrieved by the influence of Benjamin Netanyahu, who was the son of a great scholar of Jewish history, and Benzion Netanyahu, his father, and his mother's family came from Petah Tikwa, which was one of those malarial swamps that were redeemed by Jewish immigrants, and is now the center of world technology. Petah Tikva, outside of Tel Aviv, is a technology hub, and so under the leadership of Netanyahu and the joint government that took over to handle this terrible crisis of the mid-1980s, Israel turned around and became its venture capital outlays, and it's just expanded 100-fold. It was, it's just, it completely retrieved its momentum, and the key force was another massive immigration from Russia. A million Russian immigrants who were allowed to escape after the breakdown of the Soviet Union came to Israel. Many of them wanted to come to the United States, but we wouldn't have them at the time, and so they came to Israel, and they all were anti-communist. They supported Netanyahu, and now they comprise half of all the engineers in Israel's high-tech industry, and since 15-20% of them are Arab Israelis in high-tech industry. I mean, the immigration from Russia, which was really critical, and both politically because they knew socialism didn't work, and they were
So this
Netanyahu's leadership, which I described, Netanyahu has amazing heroic history as a fighter, and with his brother, and part of the Entebbe story, and so that was the transformation of Israel in the middle of the 1980s into a capitalist force an entrepreneurial force rather than a kind of socialist agricultural.
It is ironic that when you and I were growing up, I think everybody in America was cheering Israel on, but the left sent people over like Bernie Sanders to work in kibbutzes and so on, and they just loved the socialist side of it. But today they're turned off of it, and conservatives by and large are remain enthusiastic about Israel. Although I think hardly anybody really understands the full drama that you're describing, and of how the transformation has not only changed the nature of the Israeli economy, but the world economy. Yeah. And this raises another question, because it's the question that you raise in the book. It's the number one question. What is the Israel test? Yeah. What is the test? People have asked me that. What is the test? And I give them an answer, but it's a version of what you say, so you say it.
Well, how do you respond to people who excel you in creativity, achievement, intellect, wealth, imaginative, visionary, enterprise? Do you resent them and try to tear them down, or even eliminate them? Or do you admire them and emulate them and try to learn from them and share in this creative force that world Jewry constitutes, and with Israel as its spearhead?
That's essentially it, and it's applied to everybody. I've had Jewish friends say, "Oh, I'm a little embarrassed by this book because it's so pro-Jewish, and it's not so bad having a Christian say it as to have a Jew say it, because a Jew feels embarrassed to talk about it." But it is true. But it's also true about a lot of people, and the resentment of success and of successful. You've written a lot about the importance of families, about having fathers in the family, about the integrity of families, about the importance of raising children who respect elders, who respect education and apply themselves.
Judeo-Christian civilization is the foundation of all this.
Yeah, and
here and in Israel,
and of the world, and mostly of the world, if the virtues are the same. So anyway, I think that this book is destined to change our thinking in this country about what we're doing, because we certainly need a more positive national administrative attitude toward Israel. Yeah. It's been astonishing and sad to watch how we've tried to curb them and hold them back and criticize them. And yeah, you can criticize Israel, you can criticize everybody. Nobody's perfect. No country's certainly perfect. And the same thing goes for the leadership. But the innovation, the amazing things that are coming. We haven't even talked about medicine. The things they're doing in medicine are phenomenal. And so where do you think we're going with this? I mean, we've got an election coming up. We've got people rioting at universities. The appalling stupidity of the students and these NGOs that are supported by far-left philanthropists and by international governments and by our own government. Our own government puts money into these universities. And so they capitulate to protest movements, which it seems to me fail. This is a failure of the Israel.
Well, they definitely fail their Israel test. I mean, they resent and hate Israel, and they even hate Jews because of their success. I mean, I mean, for 0.2% of the people in the world to represent half the Nobel laureates and half the most successful people in the world, the pioneers of radical new technology from graphene to artificial intelligence. It's everywhere, and it's an Israel test to understand our dependence on small minorities. Thomas Sowell has written about overseas Chinese, and he says the overseas Chinese thrive everywhere they go, all over Asia, but they've suffered pogroms as big as the Jewish pogroms in Europe. And in one sense, Sowell says the Jews could be considered the overseas Chinese of Europe. It's everywhere. Progress is pioneered by a few unique people with who galvanize whole economies and societies with their new ideas and inventions, and these people are resented, and a key chapter of the Israel test describes Hitler's actual case against Jews. Hitler was very explicit. People keep thinking he thought Jews were inferior or something. But if you read Mein Kampf, you realize, which is distributed by Islamists all over the Middle East. You read Mein Kampf, and his case was that Jews are just resented. He resented Jews for their superiority in handling money and in starting banks and financing companies. He thought that real test of human virtue was not creativity and intellect, but the warrior mystique. And if people weren't willing to give their lives on the battlefield in a zero-sum war of all against all, they didn't deserve to live. The Hitler test was the warrior test, and it's kind of a Darwinian struggle for advantage was his ideal of virtue, Jews offered a different path, a path of family and worship and aspiration and invention and creativity and ultimately a win-win for the world. And today we've on our campuses there's this new plague of scarcity theory. You know, the world is somehow scarce and we're running out of resources and we're polluting the planet. And scarcity theory leads to the war of all against all. It imagines human life as a zero-sum game. Win-lose, or even, and mostly lose-lose, because wars are the result of a zero-sum game, rather than a win-win era of superabundance, as our Discovery Institute fellow Gail Pooley has written in a fabulous new book called Superabundance with Marion Tupy. Together they've revived William Nordhaus of Yale. He has a theory of time prices. You can compare different societies and different eras and different places by the amount of time a typical worker has to work in order to earn the goods and services that support his life. And superabundance shows that because of the technological revolutions spearheaded by Israel and Jews around the world, and Chinese and Americans and all kinds of Ukrainians even, but really Jews have a disproportionate so disproportionate role in all of this that it really does constitute an Israel test, whether you're going to recognize that you have to cultivate genius in order to prevail against the slings and arrows that beset human life and throughout history, in which miraculously were overcome first in the Industrial Revolution. Until then, the population of the world hardly expanded very much. But since the efflorescence of capitalism, which in the 20th century has been spearheaded by the Jewish minority, the population of the world was, under 1 billion, and it's now 8 billion. So we have 8 times as many people with longevity twice as over 70 years rather than 35 years, and we have a just drastic drop in poverty represented by time prices that Gail Pooley and Tupy and Nordhaus of Yale have shown that real advances. People used to spend all their time just getting the food to survive, and now the average person in the world spends just a few minutes a day paying for his food, and all the rest of the time can be devoted to these new pursuits that enrich our lives and open horizons for the future.
Well, I think one of the themes of Discovery Institute, as Steve Meyer has said, is that we try to show how the values, the virtues of Western civilization's ideals have made the best of the modern world. Now they need to be defended and promoted. And I think the Israel test is part of that picture. It's part of the picture that we would think presents a much more positive future outcome for our civilization than is found normally in public discourse today. So here's to you, George, and also for people getting the Israel test and taking it to heart and changing this debate that's been going on in America for the better. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce.